History from the beginning. Ancient truths hidden in the Bible. The universe holds secrets that were written down thousands of years before modern science even existed. Hidden within the pages of the Bible are truths about our origins, our purpose, and the very nature of reality itself that scholars are only beginning to understand. Tonight, you're about to discover how ancient wisdom perfectly aligns with cutting-edge discoveries, revealing a tapestry of knowledge that challenges everything you thought you knew about history, science, and human existence. What if I told you that the greatest mysteries of our time were already solved in texts written millennia ago? That the questions keeping physicists awake at night were answered by shepherds and prophets who lived before the invention of the telescope? This isn't about faith versus science. This is about uncovering the profound connections between ancient revelation and modern understanding that will fundamentally change how you see the world. From the moment consciousness first sparked in the void to the intricate design of DNA, from the mathematical precision of planetary orbits to the quantum mechanics governing reality itself, we're going to explore how biblical accounts contain scientific truths that humanity is only now beginning to comprehend. These aren't coincidences. These are breadcrumbs left by an intelligence that understood the universe's deepest workings long before we had the tools to measure them. So prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge your assumptions, expand your understanding, and reveal how the oldest book in human history might actually contain the newest insights about our existence. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just ancient history. It's the blueprint for understanding everything. Before we proceed, we have a goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers. Help us. Subscribe to our channel and leave a like in this video so we can keep making great videos like this for you. Now moving on. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not the kind of nothing you experience when you close your eyes in a dark room. This was absolute void, a complete absence of matter, energy, space, and time itself. Modern cosmology calls this the state before the Big Bang. But thousands of years ago, a text began with words that would echo through eternity. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But here's what's fascinating. The Hebrew word used for created is bara, which specifically means to bring something into existence from nothing. This isn't reshaping existing material. This is creation ex nihilo, from nothing, which perfectly aligns with our current understanding of how the universe began. The Big Bang Theory describes the sudden appearance of all matter and energy from a singularity, a point of infinite density that existed before space and time. What's remarkable is that this ancient text describes the sequence of creation in a way that mirrors what modern science tells us about the universe's formation. First, there was light. Not the sun or stars, but fundamental light energy. Scientists now understand that in the first moments after the Big Bang, the universe was filled with photons, particles of light, before matter as we know it even existed. Then came the expansion of space itself. The biblical account describes the heavens being stretched out, which is precisely how cosmologists describe cosmic inflation, the rapid expansion of space that occurred in the universe's earliest moments. This isn't metaphorical language. This is a technical description of cosmic expansion, written thousands of years before Edwin Hubble discovered that galaxies are moving away from us. The text continues with the formation of Earth, covered by water and shrouded in darkness. Geologists now know that early Earth was indeed covered by vast oceans, and the atmosphere was so thick that sunlight couldn't penetrate to the surface. The description of waters above and below the firmament corresponds to our understanding of Earth's early water cycle and atmospheric conditions. But the most stunning revelation comes when we examine the order of creation. Plants appear before the sun becomes visible from Earth's surface. This seems backwards until you realize that photosynthesis could have begun as soon as light penetrated the atmosphere. even before the sun was clearly visible through the atmospheric haze. Marine life appears before land animals. Birds are mentioned alongside sea creatures, which aligns with the evolutionary understanding that birds evolved from dinosaurs, which were essentially marine reptiles that moved onto land. The precision of this sequence is staggering. How could ancient writers have known the correct order of appearance for different life forms? How could they have understood that light existed before stars, that expansion preceded formation, that the Earth was initially covered by water? These aren't lucky guesses. These are accurate descriptions of cosmic and biological history, written by people who had no telescopes, no microscopes, no scientific instruments whatsoever. Consider the mathematical precision embedded in these accounts. The Bible describes the universe as having a beginning, which contradicts the steady-state theory that dominated science for centuries. It describes the universe as expanding, which wasn't discovered until the 20th century. It describes the Earth as suspended in space, hanging on nothing, which was revolutionary thinking in an era when most cultures believed the Earth rested on the back of a turtle or was supported by pillars. The text even hints at the fundamental forces that govern reality. The Hebrew word for spirit that moved over the waters is ruach, which also means wind or breath, suggesting an energetic force that brought order to chaos. This perfectly describes how the fundamental forces of physics, gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces emerged to create structure in the early universe. But the mysteries deepen when we examine the creation of humanity. The account describes humans being formed from the dust of the earth, which sounds primitive until you realize that every element in your body, except hydrogen, was forged in the nuclear furnaces of stars. You are literally made of stardust, cosmic dust that formed planets and eventually became the building blocks of life. The biblical phrase dust of the earth is a poetic way of describing what science now calls the stellar nuclear synthesis that created the heavy elements essential for life. The description of breath being breathed into Adam to make him a living soul points to something science is only beginning to understand: the emergence of consciousness. How does organic matter become aware? How does a collection of atoms develop the ability to contemplate its own existence? This remains one of the greatest mysteries in science, yet it's described in the very first chapters of human history as a distinct moment when life became conscious life. The Garden of Eden itself presents fascinating parallels to what we know about human origins. Archaeological evidence suggests that human civilization began in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is precisely where the biblical account places the Garden of Eden. The description of 4 rivers flowing from Eden matches the geographical layout of ancient Mesopotamia, suggesting that this account preserves genuine historical memory of humanity's earliest settlements. Even more intriguing is the description of the Tree of Life. Modern genetics has discovered that all life on Earth shares a common genetic code, as if all living things branch from a single source. The image of a tree whose fruit grants eternal life mirrors our understanding of how genetic information is passed down through generations, how DNA serves as the blueprint for all biological existence. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents something profound about human consciousness. Unlike other animals, humans possess moral awareness, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. This cognitive capacity appears to be unique to our species, suggesting that something fundamental changed in human development at a specific point in our history. The biblical account frames this as a choice that fundamentally altered human nature, introducing mortality and moral responsibility. The serpent in this account has puzzled interpreters for millennia, but consider this. The Hebrew word for serpent, nachash, comes from a root that means to whisper or to practice divination. This suggests not just a physical creature, but an intelligence that could communicate complex ideas, that could reason and persuade. The description of the serpent as more cunning than any beast of the field points to a form of intelligence that was sophisticated enough to understand human psychology and exploit it. What's remarkable is how this ancient account captures something profound about human nature that psychology and neuroscience are only now beginning to understand. The decision to eat from the forbidden tree represents the moment when humans became fully self-aware, when they developed the capacity for abstract thought, moral reasoning, and the ability to imagine possibilities beyond their immediate experience. The immediate consequence, awareness of nakedness and the feeling of shame, points to the development of self-consciousness, the ability to see oneself from an external perspective. This is a uniquely human trait that emerges in child development around the age of 2, when children first recognize themselves in mirrors and begin to understand that others can see them as they see others. The conversation between God and the first humans after their disobedience reveals something fascinating about human psychology. When confronted with their actions, Adam immediately shifts blame to Eve and implicitly to God himself. "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree." This defensive response, the instinct to avoid responsibility and shift blame, is a fundamental aspect of human psychology that emerges from our capacity for moral reasoning. Eve's response is equally revealing. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." This acknowledgement of deception points to humanity's vulnerability to manipulation, our capacity to be influenced by external forces that appeal to our desires and ambitions. The entire scene reads like a psychological case study of human behavior under moral pressure. The consequences described in this account, pain in childbirth, difficulty in agriculture, and ultimately death, can be understood as the natural result of living in a world where moral choices have real consequences. The introduction of moral awareness necessarily brings with it the possibility of moral failure, and moral failure in a physical world inevitably leads to physical and emotional suffering. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this ancient account is how it frames human existence not as a cosmic accident, but as the result of intentional design. The repeated phrase, "and God saw that it was good," suggests a universe that is fundamentally ordered, purposeful, and meaningful. This stands in stark contrast to the materialist worldview that sees human existence as an accidental byproduct of random processes. The biblical account presents consciousness not as an emergent property of complex matter, but as something that was intentionally introduced into the physical world. This perspective aligns with some of the most puzzling discoveries in modern science, particularly in quantum mechanics, where consciousness appears to play a fundamental role in determining reality itself. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics suggests that reality doesn't exist in a definite state until it's observed by a conscious observer. This implies that consciousness isn't just a byproduct of physical processes, but may be fundamental to the structure of reality itself. The biblical account of creation places consciousness at the center of existence, suggesting that the universe was designed to be observed, understood, and appreciated by conscious beings. This raises profound questions about the nature of reality itself. If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, if the cosmos was designed to be comprehended by intelligent observers, then perhaps the ancient texts weren't just describing historical events, but revealing something essential about the structure of existence itself. The implications are staggering. If the biblical account contains accurate information about cosmic origins, biological development, and human consciousness that couldn't have been known through ancient observation, then we must seriously consider the possibility that these texts contain genuine revelation about the nature of reality. But this is just the beginning. As we continue our journey through ancient wisdom, we'll discover how the stories that followed, the accounts of early human history, contain insights about genetics, psychology, and social development that are only now being confirmed by modern research. The patterns we've observed in the creation account, the precise correspondence between ancient description and modern discovery, continue throughout the historical narratives that follow. The question isn't whether these ancient texts contain scientific truth. The question is how much scientific truth they contain, and what that means for our understanding of human origins, purpose, and destiny. Because if these accounts are accurate about the past, they might also be accurate about the future. The story of Cain and Abel isn't just humanity's first murder case. It's a genetic roadmap that reveals profound truths about human nature, behavioral psychology, and the biological foundations of morality that science is only beginning to understand. When we examine this ancient account through the lens of modern research, we discover insights about sibling rivalry, personality development, and the neurological basis of violence that read like a textbook on evolutionary psychology. Consider the setup. Two brothers, different occupations, different personalities, different approaches to life. Cain worked the soil, methodical and persistent, while Abel tended flocks, adaptive and mobile. This isn't just career choice. Modern genetics shows us that personality traits like risk-taking, novelty-seeking, and social cooperation have strong hereditary components. The fact that these brothers, sharing the same parents, developed such different temperaments points to something fundamental about human genetic diversity. The biblical account describes their offerings to God, and here's where it gets fascinating. Abel's offering was accepted, while Cain's was rejected. The text doesn't explicitly state why, but it hints that the issue was with Cain's heart, his attitude, his internal state. Modern neuroscience has discovered that our brains are constantly making moral calculations, weighing intentions against outcomes, evaluating the sincerity behind our actions. The anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region responsible for moral decision-making, responds differently to genuine versus performative moral behavior. Cain's response to rejection reveals something crucial about human psychology. Rather than examining his own motivations, he becomes consumed with envy toward his brother. This emotional cascade, from disappointment to resentment to rage, follows a predictable neurological pathway. The amygdala, our brain's alarm system, triggers the release of stress hormones that cloud judgment and amplify negative emotions. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and impulse control, becomes compromised under intense emotional stress. The warning Cain receives is remarkable. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. This ancient description of temptation as a predatory force perfectly captures what modern psychology calls the dual process theory of moral behavior. We have two systems operating in our brains: the automatic, emotional system that responds to immediate impulses, and the controlled, rational system that evaluates consequences and makes deliberate choices. The metaphor of sin as a crouching predator describes the constant tension between these systems. The limbic system, our emotional brain, is always ready to respond to threats, opportunities, and desires. The prefrontal cortex must actively suppress these impulses when they conflict with our moral principles. This neurological battle between instinct and conscience is fundamental to human experience. What happens next reveals the tragic consequences when this internal struggle is lost. Cain lures Abel into a field, away from witnesses, and commits the first recorded murder. This premeditated aspect is significant because it demonstrates the uniquely human capacity for planned violence. While animals kill for territory, food, or defense, humans are capable of deliberate, calculated harm based on abstract emotions like envy and resentment. The immediate aftermath shows something profound about human conscience. When confronted by God, Cain's response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" reveals both guilt and defiance. The question itself acknowledges the concept of moral responsibility while attempting to reject it. This internal conflict between knowledge of right and wrong and the desire to escape consequences is a fundamental aspect of human psychology that emerges from our capacity for moral reasoning. The punishment Cain receives is equally revealing. He becomes a wanderer, unable to find peace or stability. Modern psychology recognizes this as a classic description of what we now call moral injury, the psychological damage that results from perpetrating acts that violate our own moral code. Veterans, first responders, and others who have witnessed or participated in violence often experience similar symptoms: restlessness, inability to connect with others, and a persistent sense of alienation. The mark placed on Cain to protect him from revenge is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. It suggests an early understanding of justice systems, the need to prevent cycles of retribution that could destroy communities. This protective marking implies that even in humanity's earlier stages, there was recognition that punishment should serve rehabilitation and deterrence rather than mere vengeance. But the deeper implications of this story extend far beyond individual psychology. The account describes the beginning of human civilization, with Cain founding the first city. This transition from nomadic to settled life represents one of the most significant developments in human history. Archaeological evidence shows that the shift to urban living, which occurred around 10,000 years ago, fundamentally changed human social structures, economic systems, and cultural development. The genealogy that follows reveals something remarkable about human technological development. Cain's descendants are credited with innovations in metallurgy, music, and animal husbandry. This suggests that creativity and innovation often emerge from struggle and displacement. Modern research in psychology confirms that moderate levels of stress and challenge can enhance creative problem solving and drive technological advancement. The story of Noah and the flood presents another layer of ancient wisdom that aligns with modern scientific understanding. The account describes a global catastrophe that reset human civilization, preserving only a small remnant to repopulate the earth. While debates continue about the flood's scope and nature, the genetic evidence for human population bottlenecks is undeniable. Mitochondrial DNA studies suggest that all modern humans descend from a relatively small population that lived in Africa around 70,000 years ago. This genetic bottleneck, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption that dramatically reduced human numbers, created the founder effect that explains many aspects of human genetic diversity. The biblical account of humanity, descending from a small group of survivors, mirrors this scientific understanding of our species' demographic history. The description of Noah's righteousness in a corrupt world points to something fascinating about moral development. Research in developmental psychology shows that moral reasoning develops through stages, from simple rule following to complex ethical thinking based on universal principles. Noah's ability to maintain moral integrity despite social pressure demonstrates the highest level of moral development, what psychologists call principled conscience. The construction of the ark itself represents humanity's capacity for long-term planning and technological innovation. The detailed specifications given for the vessel, including its dimensions, materials, and construction methods, describe a sophisticated understanding of naval architecture. The proportions given for the ark, with a length-to-width ratio of 6:1, are remarkably close to modern ship design principles for maximum stability and cargo capacity. The gathering of animals represents an early understanding of biodiversity and conservation. The instruction to take pairs of every kind of animal suggests recognition that species diversity is essential for ecosystem stability. Modern conservation biology confirms that genetic diversity within species is crucial for survival, particularly during environmental catastrophes. The rainbow that appears after the flood serves as a covenant sign, a promise that such destruction would never again occur. This introduction of symbolic communication between divine and human realms points to humanity's unique capacity for abstract thinking and meaning-making. The ability to understand symbols, to see beyond immediate physical reality to deeper significance, is a distinctly human cognitive capability that emerges from our advanced language processing abilities. The story of Babel reveals profound insights about human social organization and the origins of cultural diversity. The account describes humanity united by a single language, working together to build a tower that reaches the heavens. This cooperation represents the pinnacle of human collective achievement, but it also contains the seeds of its own destruction. The desire to make a name for ourselves reflects what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to overestimate our own abilities and underestimate external factors in our success. The builders of Babel displayed hubris, the dangerous pride that comes from technological advancement without corresponding wisdom or humility. The confusion of languages that follows isn't just divine punishment, but a natural consequence of human social dynamics. Linguistic research shows that languages naturally diverge when populations become isolated from each other. The Tower of Babel story captures this process in symbolic form, describing how human ambition led to division and the formation of distinct cultural groups. The dispersion of peoples that results from this linguistic confusion explains the origins of human cultural diversity. Anthropological evidence shows that human societies developed different languages, customs, and worldviews as they spread across the globe and adapted to different environments. The biblical account frames this diversity not as accidental, but as purposeful, suggesting that cultural variety serves important functions in human development. This pattern of unity followed by division, cooperation followed by conflict, appears throughout human history. Modern game theory and evolutionary psychology help explain why this cycle repeats. While cooperation provides enormous benefits, it also creates opportunities for exploitation. The tension between individual self-interest and collective good is a fundamental challenge in human social organization. The call of Abraham marks a pivotal moment in human history, the beginning of what we might call ethical monotheism. The instruction to leave his homeland and venture into the unknown represents a leap of faith that would have profound consequences for human civilization. This willingness to abandon security for principle, to choose uncertain promise over comfortable familiarity, demonstrates the uniquely human capacity for transcendent motivation. The promise made to Abraham that through his descendants all nations would be blessed suggests a universal vision of human flourishing that transcends tribal boundaries. This expansion of moral consideration from family to tribe to nation to all humanity represents a crucial development in human ethical thinking. Modern research in moral psychology shows that this expansion of the moral circle is essential for large-scale cooperation and peaceful coexistence. The covenant relationship established with Abraham introduces the concept of conditional blessing based on moral behavior. This represents a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between ethics and consequences, individual choices, and collective outcomes. The idea that moral behavior brings blessing while immoral behavior brings curse reflects an early understanding of what we now call social contract theory. The testing of Abraham's faith through the near sacrifice of Isaac reveals profound insights about moral development and the nature of ultimate commitment. The willingness to sacrifice what is most precious for the sake of principle demonstrates the highest level of moral reasoning. Yet the provision of a substitute sacrifice suggests that true moral principle never requires the destruction of innocent life. This story introduces the concept of substitutionary atonement, the idea that one life can be given in place of another. While this seems primitive to modern sensibilities, it actually reflects a sophisticated understanding of justice and mercy. The principle that wrongdoing requires payment, but that payment can be made by another, becomes central to legal systems and ethical frameworks throughout human history. The genetic promises made to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars introduces an early understanding of exponential population growth. Mathematical models show that under optimal conditions, human populations can indeed grow exponentially, doubling every generation. The comparison to stars is particularly apt, as astronomical observations reveal that the universe contains more stars than grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches. The land promise given to Abraham's descendants introduces the concept of territorial inheritance based on moral grounds rather than mere conquest. This represents a revolutionary approach to land ownership and political authority. Instead of might making right, the biblical account suggests that moral character and divine calling determine legitimate claims to territory and leadership. The story of Isaac and Rebekah reveals insights about genetic inheritance and mate selection. The careful attention to family lineage and the journey to find a wife from among Abraham's relatives suggests an early understanding of genetic compatibility and the importance of shared values in marriage. Modern genetics confirms that moderate levels of genetic similarity, but not too much, optimize reproductive success. The account of Jacob and Esau presents a fascinating study in twin psychology and the nature versus nurture debate. Despite sharing the same parents and environment, these twins develop dramatically different personalities and life paths. Jacob, the quiet contemplative type, contrasts sharply with Esau, the impulsive outdoorsman. This difference in temperament from birth suggests that personality has strong genetic components. The exchange of the birthright for a bowl of stew reveals something profound about human psychology and the power of immediate gratification. Esau's willingness to trade his inheritance for temporary satisfaction demonstrates what psychologists call temporal discounting, the tendency to value immediate rewards more highly than future benefits. This cognitive bias, while sometimes adaptive in survival situations, can lead to poor long-term decision-making. Jacob's deception in obtaining Isaac's blessing raises complex questions about moral behavior and divine sovereignty. While the deception itself is clearly wrong, the outcome aligns with the earlier prophecy that the older will serve the younger. This suggests that moral complexity often surrounds significant historical events, that right and wrong are not always clearly distinguished in the moment. The reconciliation between Jacob and Esau years later demonstrates the human capacity for forgiveness and the healing of family relationships. Despite decades of separation and resentment, the brothers are able to embrace and find peace. This restoration suggests that even the deepest wounds can heal when approached with humility and genuine remorse. These ancient narratives, when examined through the lens of modern scientific understanding, reveal remarkable insights about human nature, social organization, and moral development. The patterns they describe, the psychological dynamics they explore, and the principles they establish continue to shape human civilization thousands of years later. But perhaps most significantly, they suggest that the fundamental questions about human existence, our origins, our purpose, and our destiny have been with us from the very beginning. The story of Joseph unfolds as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated narrative in ancient literature, revealing profound insights about dream interpretation, leadership psychology, and the dynamics of family trauma that modern research is only beginning to fully understand. When we examine this account through the lens of contemporary neuroscience and behavioral psychology, we discover a masterclass in emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and the transformative power of forgiveness that reads like a modern textbook on human development. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams wasn't supernatural mysticism, but represents an early understanding of symbolic thinking and pattern recognition that neuroscience now recognizes as fundamental to human cognition. The brain's capacity to process symbolic information, to see connections between seemingly unrelated events, and to predict future outcomes based on present patterns, is what separates human intelligence from other forms of consciousness. Joseph's interpretations weren't random guesses, but sophisticated analyses of psychological and environmental factors that could influence future events. The dreams themselves reveals something fascinating about the unconscious mind's ability to process complex social dynamics. Joseph's childhood dreams of his brothers bowing down to him weren't mere fantasies, but reflected an intuitive understanding of family hierarchies and future possibilities. Modern research in sleep psychology shows that dreams often process social information and emotional conflicts in ways that conscious thought cannot, suggesting that Joseph's dreams contain genuine insights about family dynamics and future relationships. The reaction of Joseph's brothers to these dreams demonstrates the psychological principle of projection, where individuals attribute their own unconscious feelings to others. Their violent response to Joseph's dreams reflected their own insecurities about their father's favoritism and their position within the family structure. The special coat given to Joseph by Jacob wasn't just a gift, but a visible symbol of preference that triggered deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and competition among the siblings. The decision to sell Joseph into slavery, rather than kill him outright, reveals the complex moral reasoning that occurs during group decision-making. Research in social psychology shows that groups often make decisions that individual members would find morally reprehensible, a phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility. Judah's suggestion to profit from their crime, rather than simply commit murder, demonstrates how moral reasoning can be corrupted by rationalization and self-interest. Joseph's experience in Egypt provides remarkable insights into resilient psychology and the factors that enable some individuals to thrive despite severe trauma. His rise from slavery to a position of authority in Potiphar's house demonstrates what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the ability to develop greater strength and wisdom through adversity. The text emphasizes that Joseph's success came from his integrity and competence, qualities that remained intact despite his traumatic circumstances. The attempted seduction by Potiphar's wife presents a fascinating case study in moral decision-making under pressure. Joseph's refusal wasn't based on fear of consequences, but on principle, specifically his loyalty to his master and his understanding of right and wrong. This demonstrates what psychologists call moral courage, the ability to act ethically despite personal cost. The neurological basis of such decisions involves the prefrontal cortex overriding limbic system impulses, a process that requires significant mental energy and strong moral convictions. The false accusation and subsequent imprisonment that followed Joseph's moral choice illustrates a harsh reality about ethical behavior. Doing right doesn't always lead to immediate reward. This delayed gratification aspect of moral behavior is one of the most challenging aspects of human psychology. The ability to maintain ethical standards despite negative consequences requires what psychologists call distress tolerance, the capacity to endure emotional pain without abandoning one's values. Joseph's interpretation of dreams for his fellow prisoners reveals advanced understanding of human psychology and the power of hope in sustaining individuals through difficult circumstances. His ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to future possibilities demonstrates what cognitive psychologists call prospective thinking, the uniquely human capacity to mentally simulate future scenarios and plan accordingly. The Pharaoh's dreams about 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, weren't just prophetic visions, but reflected sophisticated understanding of economic cycles and environmental patterns. Agricultural societies throughout history have experienced periodic fluctuations in productivity due to weather patterns, soil depletion, and other natural factors. Joseph's interpretation demonstrated advanced systems thinking, the ability to see connections between seemingly separate events and plan for long-term consequences. The economic policy Joseph implemented during the years of abundance reveals remarkable insights into resource management and social planning. The decision to store grain during productive years and distribute it during lean times represents one of the earliest examples of counter-cyclical economic policy. Modern economists recognize this approach as essential for maintaining social stability during economic downturns. The psychological transformation Joseph underwent during his years in Egypt is equally remarkable. The traumatized teenager who was sold into slavery emerged as a mature leader capable of managing complex social and economic systems. This development demonstrates what psychologists call identity formation through adversity, the process by which individuals develop stronger sense of self through overcoming challenges. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt seeking food, the emotional dynamics that unfolded reveal profound insights about family psychology and the long-term effects of trauma on relationships. Joseph's decision to test his brothers before revealing his identity wasn't cruelty, but wisdom, an attempt to understand whether they had changed since their betrayal years earlier. This careful approach to reconciliation demonstrates advanced emotional intelligence and conflict resolution skills. The tests Joseph devised for his brothers were specifically designed to reveal their character and determine whether they had developed empathy and moral courage. The demand that Benjamin accompany them on their second journey wasn't arbitrary, but strategic, forcing them to confront their willingness to sacrifice another favored son. Judah's offer to take Benjamin's place demonstrated the character growth that Joseph was seeking, showing that his brothers had learned from their past mistakes. The emotional climax when Joseph finally revealed his identity to his brothers provides one of the most psychologically sophisticated descriptions of forgiveness in ancient literature. His statement that, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," demonstrates what psychologists call meaning-making, the ability to find positive significance in negative experiences. This cognitive reframing is essential for healing from trauma and maintaining psychological well-being. The reunion between Joseph and his father Jacob represents the restoration of broken family bonds and the healing power of reconciliation. The text emphasizes the intensity of emotion involved, suggesting that the psychological wounds created by family trauma run deep, but can be healed through genuine remorse and forgiveness. This restoration process requires both parties to acknowledge past hurts and commit to rebuilding trust. The migration of Jacob's family to Egypt sets the stage for one of history's most significant demographic transitions. The movement of 70 individuals who would eventually become a nation of millions demonstrates the exponential growth potential of human populations under favorable conditions. Mathematical models confirm that small founding populations can indeed grow to enormous numbers within relatively short timeframes when environmental conditions are optimal. The initial prosperity of the Israelites in Egypt, their multiplication and success in the land of Goshen, reflects the advantages that immigrant populations often experience when they bring valuable skills to new environments. Joseph's administrative abilities and his family's expertise in animal husbandry provided economic benefits that made them welcome in Egyptian society. This mutually beneficial relationship demonstrates how cultural exchange can create prosperity for all parties involved. The transition from prosperity to oppression that occurred after Joseph's death reveals the fragility of social acceptance and the tendency for fear to overcome rational economic considerations. The new pharaoh's concern about the growing Israelite population demonstrates what psychologists call outgroup threat perception, the tendency to view demographic changes as potential security risks rather than economic opportunities. The decision to enslave the Israelites rather than simply expel them reveals the economic motivations that often underlie oppression. The Egyptians had become dependent on Israelite labor and productivity, creating a situation where exploitation became more profitable than elimination. This dynamic has repeated throughout history, showing how economic systems can perpetuate injustice even when it contradicts moral principles. The birth of Moses during this period of oppression introduces themes of hidden identity and destined leadership that resonate throughout human history. The circumstances of his rescue, being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter while being nursed by his own mother, created a unique psychological situation where he experienced both privilege and connection to his oppressed people. This dual identity would prove crucial in his later role as liberator and lawgiver. Moses' violent response to witnessing Egyptian oppression of a Hebrew slave reveals the psychological tension that builds when individuals witness injustice against their own people. His immediate recourse to violence, while understandable emotionally, demonstrates the inadequacy of individual action against systemic oppression. The failure of this approach forced Moses to flee to the wilderness, where he would undergo the character development necessary for effective leadership. The 40 years Moses spent in the wilderness represents a crucial period of psychological and spiritual development. Research in adult development shows that individuals often require extended periods of reflection and growth before they're ready to assume major leadership responsibilities. Moses' experience as a shepherd provided him with skills in guidance, protection, and long-term thinking that would prove essential in leading the Israelites through their own wilderness journey. The burning bush encounter that called Moses to leadership reveals advanced understanding of how transformative experiences occur. The symbol of fire that burns without consuming represents the paradox of spiritual illumination, an experience that changes individuals fundamentally while leaving them essentially intact. This metaphor captures something profound about peak experiences and their role in human development. Moses' initial reluctance to accept the leadership role demonstrates healthy self-awareness and humility. His concerns about his speaking ability and his people's potential rejection show realistic assessment of the challenges involved. This reluctance, rather than disqualifying him for leadership, actually suggests the kind of thoughtful consideration that effective leaders require. The signs and wonders that accompanied Moses' calling weren't just supernatural displays, but demonstrations of natural principles that could be understood and replicated. The staff that became a serpent, the hand that became leprous and then healed, the water that turned to blood, all represented mastery over natural processes that seemed miraculous to observers who didn't understand the underlying mechanisms. The confrontation with Pharaoh that followed reveals sophisticated understanding of political psychology and the dynamics of power. The progressive escalation of plagues wasn't random, but carefully designed to demonstrate the inadequacy of Egyptian religious beliefs and the superiority of the Hebrew conception of divine power. Each plague targeted specific aspects of Egyptian spirituality and economic life, creating mounting pressure for Pharaoh to release the Israelites. The psychological battle between Moses and Pharaoh represents the classic conflict between tyrannical authority and moral leadership. Pharaoh's repeated promises to release the Israelites, followed by changes of heart, demonstrate what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that occurs when actions conflict with beliefs. His inability to maintain consistent decisions under pressure reveals the fundamental weakness of power based on fear rather than principle. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, represents the ultimate consequence of persistent moral failure. The Passover ritual that protected the Israelites wasn't arbitrary, but demonstrated the principle that preparation and obedience provide protection from consequences that affect the unprepared. This event established the foundation for one of humanity's most enduring religious observances and introduced the concept of substitutionary sacrifice that would resonate throughout human history. The exodus from Egypt that followed represents one of history's most significant liberation movements, involving approximately 2 million people leaving slavery to establish a new society based on divine law rather than human authority. The logistics of this migration, the organization required, and the social dynamics involved provide insights into large-scale social change and the challenges of transitioning from oppression to freedom. The parting of the Red Sea, whether understood as supernatural intervention or natural phenomenon, represents the moment when human faith and divine power converge to create the impossible. The timing of this event, occurring precisely when the Israelites needed escape and their enemies needed defeat, demonstrates the kind of synchronicity that characterizes pivotal moments in human history. The destruction of the Egyptian army that followed serves as a definitive end to the old order and the beginning of something entirely new. The song of celebration that the Israelites sang afterward reveals the psychological transformation that occurs when oppressed people suddenly find themselves free. This transition from slavery to liberty represents one of the most profound changes possible in human experience. The wilderness journey that began after the Exodus provides a fascinating study in group psychology and the challenges of social development. The complaints and rebellions that repeatedly occurred demonstrate how quickly people can forget past suffering and focus on present discomfort. The psychological adjustments required to transition from slavery to freedom proved more difficult than the physical challenges of desert travel. The provision of manna and water in the wilderness reveals sophisticated understanding of how to maintain morale and unity during difficult transitions. The daily provision of food created a rhythm of dependence and gratitude that prevented long-term anxiety about survival while requiring daily trust in divine provision. This system demonstrates advanced understanding of human psychology and the importance of routine in maintaining social cohesion. The giving of the law at Mount Sinai represents one of history's most significant moments in moral and legal development. The Ten Commandments and the detailed regulations that followed established principles of justice, social responsibility, and personal conduct that would influence legal systems throughout human history. The psychological impact of receiving these laws directly from divine authority created a foundation for social order that transcended human political arrangements. The golden calf incident that occurred while Moses was on the mountain reveals the human tendency to create tangible representations of spiritual realities. The people's need for visible symbols of divine presence demonstrates something fundamental about human psychology and the challenge of maintaining faith in abstract principles. This event established the ongoing tension between spiritual idealism and human limitations that characterizes religious experience. The construction of the tabernacle that followed provided a focal point for worship and community identity that could be transported during their nomadic period. The detailed specifications for this portable sanctuary demonstrate advanced understanding of sacred architecture and the psychological importance of physical spaces in maintaining spiritual focus. The craftsmanship required and the materials used reveal sophisticated artistic and technical capabilities among the Israelites. The 40 years of wilderness wandering that followed represents a complete generational transition from slavery to freedom. The psychological transformation required to change from a slave mentality to a free people capable of governing themselves could not occur overnight, but required an entire generation to develop new patterns of thinking and behavior. This extended period of development demonstrates the time required for fundamental social change. The death of Moses at the end of this period represents the passing of transformational leadership to a new generation ready to implement the vision he had articulated. His final speeches, recorded in Deuteronomy, provide a comprehensive review of the principles and practices necessary for maintaining a just society. The emphasis on remembering their history and teaching it to future generations demonstrates understanding of how cultural memory shapes social behavior. The approach to the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership represents the culmination of the liberation process begun in Egypt. The psychological preparation required for the conquest, the strategic planning involved, and the moral principles governing their actions reveal sophisticated understanding of warfare, justice, and social development. The emphasis on following divine commands, rather than human strategy, demonstrates the continuing importance of moral authority in effective leadership. These ancient narratives, when examined through the lens of modern understanding, reveal remarkable insights about human psychology, social development, and the principles that govern successful societies. The patterns they describe, the psychological dynamics they explore, and the moral principles they establish continue to influence human civilization thousands of years later. The consistency between these ancient accounts and modern scientific understanding suggests that they contain genuine wisdom about the nature of human existence and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. The conquest of Canaan under Joshua's leadership reveals profound insights about military strategy, psychological warfare, and the principles of justice that modern analysts are only beginning to fully appreciate. When we examine these ancient accounts through the lens of contemporary understanding, we discover sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution, territorial acquisition, and social integration that demonstrate remarkable foresight about human nature and organizational dynamics. The crossing of the Jordan River presents a fascinating study in leadership psychology and the power of symbolic acts to transform group consciousness. The instruction for the priest to step into the flooding river before the waters parted wasn't arbitrary, but demonstrates advanced understanding of how leaders must model courage before expecting others to follow. Modern leadership research confirms that authentic leadership requires personal risk-taking and visible commitment to shared goals before others will invest their trust and energy. The psychological impact of this miraculous crossing on both the Israelites and their enemies reveals sophisticated understanding of morale warfare and the role of reputation in conflict. The text emphasizes that news of this event spread throughout the land, causing fear among the Canaanite peoples and confidence among the Israelites. This demonstrates early recognition of how information and perception shape outcomes before physical battles even begin. The strategy employed at Jericho represents one of history's most unusual military tactics, yet it reveals profound insights about psychological warfare and the power of unconventional approaches to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The instruction to march around the city for 7 days without attacking seems illogical from a conventional military perspective, but it served multiple psychological purposes that modern strategists now recognize as highly effective. The daily marching created mounting psychological pressure on the defenders, while building unity and anticipation among the attackers. The silence maintained during these marches heightened tension and prevented the enemy from understanding Israelite intentions. The use of trumpets and shouting on the 7th day created a coordinated psychological shock that may have contributed to the wall's collapse through both supernatural intervention and natural resonance effects. The complete destruction of Jericho that followed demonstrates the ancient understanding that some conflicts require total resolution rather than partial victory. The instruction to destroy everything except precious metals, which were dedicated to the treasury, reveals sophisticated thinking about resource allocation and the prevention of moral contamination through material temptation. This approach, while seeming harsh by modern standards, reflects understanding that half measures in fundamental conflicts often lead to recurring problems. The failure at Ai that immediately followed provides crucial insights about the relationship between individual moral failure and collective consequences. Achan's secret retention of forbidden items from Jericho's destruction created a breach in community trust that affected military effectiveness. This demonstrates early recognition of how hidden moral failures can undermine group cohesion and operational success, a principle that modern organizational psychology confirms in contemporary contexts. The public exposure and punishment of Achan's sin reveals sophisticated understanding of how moral accountability must be visible and decisive to maintain community standards. The involvement of his entire family in the consequences, while troubling to modern sensibilities, reflects ancient understanding that individual actions have systemic effects that ripple through social networks. This collective responsibility model demonstrates recognition that moral behavior is not merely personal, but fundamentally social. The successful second assault on Ai employed classic military deception, using an ambush strategy that required precise coordination and timing. The psychological elements of this victory, particularly the way it restored confidence after the initial defeat, demonstrate understanding of how military success depends as much on morale and leadership credibility as on tactical superiority. Joshua's personal involvement in the battle, holding his spear toward the city until victory was complete, provided visible leadership that inspired his forces and intimidated his enemies. The treaty with the Gibeonites presents a complex case study in international relations and the challenges of making binding agreements under deceptive circumstances. The Gibeonites' successful impersonation of distant travelers reveals sophisticated understanding of how to exploit cultural assumptions and legal frameworks to achieve survival goals. Their deception succeeded because it appealed to Israelite concepts of hospitality and treaty obligations while avoiding the fate designated for local inhabitants. The discovery of this deception created a legal and moral dilemma that tested the Israelites' commitment to their word versus their strategic objectives. The decision to honor the treaty despite the deception demonstrates advanced understanding of how legal consistency and trustworthiness must be maintained even when inconvenient. This principle, that agreements must be kept even when obtained through deception, reflects sophisticated jurisprudential thinking about the nature of contracts and social trust. The long-term consequences of this decision, making the Gibeonites permanent servants rather than destroying them, created a model for how conquered peoples could be integrated into Israelite society while maintaining distinct roles and responsibilities. This approach demonstrates early understanding of how complex societies can incorporate diverse populations while maintaining social order and cultural identity. The Southern Campaign that followed reveals advanced military strategy and the importance of rapid, decisive action in maintaining momentum during conquest. The coalition of kings who united against the Israelites demonstrates how external threats can create temporary alliances among otherwise competing groups. Joshua's response, a surprise night march followed by a sustained assault, shows understanding of how speed and surprise can overcome numerical disadvantages. The miraculous extension of daylight during this battle, whether understood as supernatural intervention or natural phenomenon, represents the convergence of human preparation and divine assistance that characterizes pivotal moments in history. The psychological impact of this event on both sides demonstrates how extraordinary circumstances can create lasting changes in group consciousness and historical memory. The systematic conquest of the land that followed reveals sophisticated understanding of territorial control and the importance of eliminating resistance centers that could serve as bases for future rebellion. The destruction of Hazor, described as the head of all the kingdoms, demonstrates strategic thinking about how to permanently alter regional power structures. The burning of this city, while preserving others for occupation, shows selective application of destruction for maximum strategic effect. The distribution of the land among the tribes represents one of history's most systematic approaches to territorial organization and governance. The detailed boundaries described for each tribal inheritance demonstrate advanced surveying and administrative capabilities. The allocation process, involving both divine guidance and practical considerations about tribal size and needs, reveals sophisticated understanding of how to balance spiritual principles with practical requirements. The establishment of cities of refuge represents a revolutionary approach to justice that balances individual rights with social protection. The concept that someone who committed unintentional homicide could find sanctuary in designated cities demonstrates advanced understanding of how justice systems must distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. This legal innovation shows recognition that punishment must be proportionate to intent and that society has responsibilities to protect both victims and perpetrators. And the Levitical cities scattered throughout the land reveals sophisticated understanding of how to maintain religious and educational unity across a geographically dispersed population. The placement of these cities created a network of religious and legal centers that could provide consistent instruction and dispute resolution. This system demonstrates early recognition of how specialized roles and distributed authority can maintain social cohesion across large territories. The period of the judges that followed Joshua's death presents a fascinating study in political psychology and the challenges of maintaining social order without centralized authority. The repeated cycle of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance reveals fundamental patterns in human behavior and social development that continue to characterize political systems throughout history. The various judges who arose during this period demonstrate different models of leadership and the diverse skills required for effective governance. Deborah's role as both prophet and military leader shows early recognition of how spiritual authority and practical leadership can be combined effectively. Her partnership with Barak in defeating the Canaanites demonstrates understanding of how complementary skills can create more effective leadership than individual authority alone. Gideon's reluctance to accept leadership and his testing of divine calling reveal healthy skepticism about authority and the importance of confirmation in leadership selection. His reduction of the army from 32,000 to 300 men demonstrates understanding of how divine power works through human weakness rather than conventional strength. The psychological impact of this victory on both the Israelites and their enemies shows how unconventional approaches can achieve results that traditional methods cannot. The story of Jephthah reveals the tragic consequences of rash vows and the importance of careful consideration in making commitments. His sacrifice of his daughter while fulfilling his vow demonstrates how rigid legalism can lead to moral tragedy. This account serves as a warning about the dangers of substituting rule following for moral reasoning, and the importance of wisdom in applying principles to specific situations. Samson's career as a judge presents a complex study in the relationship between divine gifting and personal character. His extraordinary physical strength, combined with his moral weaknesses, demonstrates how natural abilities and spiritual calling do not automatically produce wise behavior. His repeated failures with women and his eventual capture by the Philistines show how personal weaknesses can undermine even divinely appointed leadership. The climactic destruction of the Philistine temple, accomplished through Samson's final act of strength, reveals how divine purposes can be accomplished even through flawed human instruments. His prayer for strength to avenge his blindness demonstrates how personal motivation and divine purpose can converge to achieve significant results. The psychological impact of this victory on the Philistines shows how a single decisive act can shift the balance of power between competing groups. The moral chaos described at the end of the Book of Judges, summarized in the phrase, "Everyone did what was right in his own eyes," reveals the inevitable consequences of abandoning shared moral standards. The horrific stories of the Levite's concubine and the near destruction of the tribe of Benjamin demonstrate how moral relativism leads to social breakdown and violence. These accounts serve as stark warnings about the importance of maintaining ethical standards and legal systems. The transition from judges to monarchy represents one of history's most significant political developments. The shift from charismatic leadership to institutional authority. The people's demand for a king, like all the nations, reveals the human tendency to prefer visible, predictable leadership over dependence on divine guidance. This request demonstrates understanding of how political systems affect national identity and international relations. Samuel's warning about the consequences of monarchical government reveals sophisticated understanding of how centralized power tends to expand and how individual liberty decreases as state authority increases. His description of how kings would conscript soldiers, impose taxes, and command labor demonstrates early recognition of the inherent tensions between governmental power and individual freedom. This warning represents one of history's earliest critiques of absolute monarchy and the importance of limiting governmental authority. The selection of Saul as the first king demonstrates the complex relationship between popular choice and divine appointment in leadership selection. Saul's initial reluctance and his impressive physical appearance show how leadership often involves individuals who don't seek power, but possess the qualities that others recognize as necessary. His anointing by Samuel establishes the principle that legitimate authority must have both human and divine sanction. Saul's early military successes, particularly his victory over the Ammonites, demonstrate how effective leadership can unite diverse groups around common purposes. His ability to mobilize the entire nation in response to the threat against Jabesh Gilead shows understanding of how shared challenges can create national unity. The psychological impact of this victory established his credibility as a military leader and confirmed his royal authority. The gradual deterioration of Saul's leadership reveals the psychological pressures that affect individuals in positions of ultimate responsibility. His increasing paranoia, his impulsive decisions, and his eventual consultation with the Witch of Endor demonstrate how isolation and pressure can corrupt even initially capable leaders. This psychological portrait provides insights into the mental health challenges that accompany high-level leadership responsibilities. The rise of David as Saul's eventual successor presents a fascinating study in leadership development and the transition of power. David's anointing as a young shepherd boy demonstrates how divine calling often precedes human recognition and how preparation for leadership frequently occurs in obscure circumstances. His musical ability and his courage in facing Goliath show how diverse skills and experiences contribute to leadership effectiveness. The conflict between Saul and David reveals the dynamics of threatened authority and the challenges of leadership succession. Saul's attempts to kill David demonstrate how fear of replacement can drive destructive behavior in leaders. David's repeated refusal to harm Saul, despite having opportunities to do so, shows understanding of how legitimate authority must be transferred rather than seized. This restraint demonstrates the kind of character that enables effective long-term leadership. The establishment of David's kingdom represents the culmination of Israel's political development and the achievement of the promises made to the patriarchs. His conquest of Jerusalem and his establishment of a permanent capital demonstrate understanding of how political stability requires both military strength and administrative capability. The bringing of the Ark to Jerusalem shows how spiritual and political authority must be integrated for effective governance. David's organization of the kingdom, including his military structure, administrative systems, and religious arrangements, reveals sophisticated understanding of how complex societies must be organized to function effectively. His census of the people, while resulting in divine judgment, demonstrates recognition of how effective governance requires accurate information about population and resources. The consequences of this census show how even necessary administrative actions can have unintended spiritual and social effects. The Davidic covenant, promising an eternal dynasty, represents one of history's most significant political and spiritual developments. This promise established the foundation for messianic expectation and the hope for perfect leadership that would transcend human limitations. The unconditional nature of this covenant demonstrates understanding of how divine purposes operate independently of human performance, while still requiring human cooperation. David's personal failures, particularly his adultery with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah, reveal the moral vulnerabilities that affect even the most successful leaders. The confrontation by the prophet Nathan demonstrates the importance of accountability systems that can challenge even the highest authorities. David's repentance and the consequences he faced show how moral failure requires both personal acknowledgement and systemic correction. The rebellion of Absalom presents a complex study in family dynamics and political succession. Absalom's ability to turn popular sentiment against his father demonstrates understanding of how charismatic leadership can exploit legitimate grievances to gain political support. His eventual defeat and death show how rebellion against legitimate authority, even when motivated by understandable grievances, tends to produce tragic consequences. The transition from David to Solomon represents the peaceful transfer of power that establishes dynastic succession. Solomon's request for wisdom, rather than wealth or military victory, demonstrates understanding of how effective leadership requires intellectual and moral capabilities rather than just political power. His famous judgment regarding the disputed baby shows how wisdom manifests in practical decision-making that serves justice and reveals truth. Solomon's building of the temple represents the culmination of Israel's religious development and the physical manifestation of divine presence among the people. The detailed descriptions of the temple's construction demonstrate advanced architectural and artistic capabilities. The dedication ceremony, with its emphasis on divine glory filling the temple, shows understanding of how physical structures can serve spiritual purposes and create lasting cultural memory. The international recognition of Solomon's wisdom and the visits of foreign dignitaries demonstrate how intellectual achievement can enhance national prestige and create opportunities for cultural exchange. The Queen of Sheba's visit particularly shows how reputation for wisdom can attract international attention and create diplomatic opportunities. This recognition demonstrates understanding of how soft power can be as effective as military strength in international relations. Solomon's extensive building projects and his development of trade relationships reveals sophisticated understanding of how infrastructure and commerce contribute to national prosperity. His alliance with Hiram of Tyre and his trading expeditions to distant lands show recognition of how international cooperation can create mutual benefits. The wealth that flowed into Israel during this period demonstrates the economic advantages of peaceful trade over military conquest. The gradual corruption of Solomon's reign, particularly his marriage to foreign wives and his adoption of their religious practices, reveals how even the wisest leaders can be corrupted by gradual compromise. His heavy taxation and forced labor policies show how the pursuit of magnificence can burden the people and create conditions for future rebellion. This deterioration demonstrates the importance of maintaining moral principles even during periods of prosperity and success. The division of the kingdom after Solomon's death represents one of history's most significant political failures, the inability to maintain unity across generational transitions. Rehoboam's rejection of wise counsel and his harsh response to legitimate grievances demonstrate how poor leadership decisions can have permanent consequences. The immediate rebellion of the 10 northern tribes shows how quickly political unity can dissolve when leadership fails to serve the people's interests. The establishment of the northern kingdom under Jeroboam reveals the challenges of creating legitimate authority in opposition to established institutions. His creation of alternative religious centers and his appointment of non-Levitical priests demonstrate understanding of how political independence requires religious distinctiveness. However, the long-term consequences of these innovations show how pragmatic political decisions can have destructive spiritual effects. The prophetic movement that emerged during this period of divided monarchy represents one of history's most significant developments in moral and spiritual leadership. The prophets' role as independent voices challenging both kings and people demonstrates understanding of how society needs moral accountability that transcends political authority. Their messages of judgment and hope show recognition of how divine purposes operate through historical events, while maintaining standards of justice that exceed human limitations. These ancient narratives, when examined through the lens of modern understanding, reveal remarkable consistency between ancient wisdom and contemporary insights about leadership, social organization, and the principles that govern successful societies. The patterns they describe continue to influence human civilization, and their relevance to current challenges suggests that they contain enduring truths about human nature and the conditions necessary for social flourishing. The prophetic voices that emerged during Israel's divided monarchy weren't just religious figures delivering divine messages. They were sophisticated analysts of social psychology, political dynamics, and human behavior, who understood patterns that modern researchers are only beginning to recognize. When we examine their methods, their messages, and their impact through the lens of contemporary understanding, we discover remarkable insights about leadership accountability, social justice, and the psychological factors that determine whether civilizations thrive or collapse. Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel represents one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of how belief systems compete for cultural dominance. The challenge wasn't merely religious, but psychological, designed to expose the powerlessness of false ideologies when subjected to empirical testing. Modern cognitive psychology recognizes this as a classic example of hypothesis testing, where competing claims are evaluated through direct experimentation rather than theoretical argument. The elaborate ritual performed by the Baal prophets, with their frenzied dancing, self-mutilation, and desperate appeals to silent gods, demonstrates what psychologists now call cognitive dissonance in action. When deeply held beliefs are challenged by contrary evidence, individuals often intensify their commitment rather than acknowledge error. The escalating desperation of Baal's prophets reveals the psychological mechanisms that drive extremist behavior when worldviews are threatened. Elijah's approach, by contrast, was methodical and designed for maximum psychological impact. His repair of the altar, his use of 12 stones representing the united tribes, and his drenching of the sacrifice with water weren't arbitrary details but carefully orchestrated elements designed to eliminate any possibility of deception. The prayer he offered was brief and direct, appealing to historical precedent and requesting clear demonstration of divine power. This approach demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to structure compelling arguments and create decisive moments that resolve uncertainty. The immediate response of fire from heaven that consumed not only the sacrifice but the stones, water, and dust around the altar created an undeniable demonstration of power that transformed the psychological landscape instantly. The people's immediate confession that the Lord is God reveals how decisive evidence can shift mass opinion when presented in the right context. This event demonstrates the power of empirical demonstration over theoretical argument in changing deeply held beliefs. The execution of the false prophets that followed, while shocking to modern sensibilities, reflects ancient understanding of how ideological conflicts must be resolved decisively to prevent recurring problems. The principle that false teaching leads to social destruction required swift action to protect the community from continued deception. This demonstrates early recognition of how ideas have consequences and how societies must actively defend truth against corruption. The drought that preceded this confrontation and the rain that followed Elijah's victory reveals sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors influence social and political stability. The 3-year absence of rain created economic hardship that challenged the effectiveness of Baal worship, which specifically promised agricultural prosperity. The return of rain after the demonstration of divine power created a powerful correlation between spiritual truth and material blessing that reinforced the lesson for generations. For Elijah's subsequent depression and flight to the wilderness demonstrates the psychological toll that intense spiritual leadership exacts on individuals. His request to die after achieving his greatest victory reveals what modern psychology recognizes as post-traumatic stress and burnout. The gentle care he received, including sleep, food, and gradual restoration, shows advanced understanding of how to help individuals recover from intense psychological pressure. The still small voice that Elijah heard in the cave represents a profound insight about how divine communication often occurs through subtle internal impressions rather than dramatic external manifestations. This recognition that spiritual guidance comes through quiet reflection rather than spectacular displays demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how human consciousness interfaces with transcendent reality. Modern neuroscience confirms that insight and creativity often emerge from quiet contemplation rather than intense activity. The commission Elijah received to anoint new political and religious leaders reveals understanding of how social change requires systematic replacement of corrupted leadership structures. The instruction to anoint Hazael as king of Syria, Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha as prophet demonstrates strategic thinking about how to create coordinated pressure for reform across multiple domains. This approach shows recognition that lasting change requires simultaneous action in political, military, and spiritual spheres. Elisha's ministry that followed provides remarkable insights into the psychology of mentorship and the transfer of spiritual authority. His request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit wasn't presumptuous, but demonstrated understanding of how successors must exceed their predecessors to maintain institutional effectiveness. The miracles he performed, often involving practical solutions to everyday problems, show how spiritual authority manifests through service to human needs, rather than mere displays of power. The healing of Naaman, the Syrian general, presents a fascinating study in cultural psychology and the barriers that prevent people from receiving help. Naaman's initial anger at being told to wash in the Jordan River reveals how pride and cultural assumptions can prevent individuals from accepting simple solutions to complex problems. His servant's wise counsel that he should try the easy remedy demonstrates the importance of humble advisors who can overcome the blind spots of authority figures. The story of the widow's oil reveals profound insights about resource management and the psychology of scarcity. The miraculous multiplication of oil based on the containers available demonstrates a principle that modern economics recognizes: that abundance is often limited not by available resources, but by our capacity to receive and utilize them. This account shows understanding of how faith and practical action must combine to create material provision. The resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son provides one of history's most detailed accounts of the psychological impact of child loss and restoration. The woman's journey to find Elisha, her refusal to explain her crisis to anyone else, and her persistent faith despite devastating circumstances demonstrate remarkable psychological resilience. Elisha's method of restoration, lying on the child and breathing into him, shows understanding of how life-giving energy can be transmitted through intimate contact. The Northern Kingdom's persistent idolatry, despite these demonstrations of divine power, reveals the psychological mechanisms that maintain destructive behavior patterns even in the face of contrary evidence. The 19 kings who ruled Israel, all of whom continued the religious innovations of Jeroboam, demonstrate how institutional momentum can override individual judgment. This pattern shows how systemic corruption becomes self-perpetuating when leadership selection favors continuity over reform. The Assyrian conquest that eventually destroyed the Northern Kingdom represents one of history's most thorough examples of cultural annihilation through forced relocation. The policy of scattering conquered peoples across the empire while importing foreign populations to replace them demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to prevent rebellion by destroying cultural identity. The lost 10 tribes of Israel disappeared not through physical destruction, but through cultural assimilation that erased their distinct identity. The survival of the southern kingdom of Judah for an additional century and a half reveals the protective value of maintaining spiritual and cultural integrity, even under political pressure. The reforms undertaken by kings like Hezekiah and Josiah demonstrate how renewal movements can extend the life of declining civilizations. Their efforts to restore temple worship, eliminate foreign influences, and renew covenant commitment show understanding of how spiritual renewal can create social stability. The prophetic messages delivered during this period reveal sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual moral choices and collective consequences. Isaiah's warnings about trusting in foreign alliances rather than divine protection demonstrate recognition of how political pragmatism can undermine the principles that ensure long-term survival. His prophecies about the coming exile weren't mere predictions, but logical consequences of moral and spiritual decline. Jeremiah's ministry during Judah's final years provides remarkable insights into the psychology of denial and the human tendency to ignore warnings about impending disaster. His repeated calls for repentance and his accurate predictions of destruction were consistently rejected by both leaders and people who preferred comforting lies to uncomfortable truths. This demonstrates how cognitive biases can prevent individuals and societies from responding appropriately to genuine threats. The Babylonian exile that followed represents one of history's most significant examples of how cultural identity can survive political destruction. The maintenance of Jewish religious practices, legal traditions, and historical memory during 70 years of displacement demonstrates remarkable social cohesion. The writings produced during this period, including many of the Psalms and prophetic books, show how suffering can stimulate creativity and deepen spiritual understanding. The Persian conquest of Babylon and the subsequent return of the Jewish exiles reveals how international political changes can create opportunities for cultural restoration. Cyrus's decree permitting the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple demonstrates enlightened imperial policy that recognized the stabilizing value of allowing subject peoples to maintain their traditional practices. This approach shows understanding of how tolerance and accommodation can create more stable governance than oppression. The reconstruction of the temple under Zerubbabel and the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls under Nehemiah demonstrate the importance of physical symbols in maintaining cultural identity. The emotional response of the older generation who remembered the original temple reveals how architectural restoration can trigger powerful memories and renew hope for the future. The systematic organization of the rebuilding project shows sophisticated understanding of project management and community mobilization. The religious reforms implemented by Ezra demonstrate how textual authority can reshape social behavior and restore cultural boundaries. His reading of the law to the assembled people and their emotional response show how forgotten principles can regain power when presented in the right context. The mass divorce of foreign wives that followed, while harsh by modern standards, demonstrates the ancient understanding that cultural survival requires maintenance of distinct identity markers. The period of Greek rule that followed Persian control introduced new challenges to Jewish cultural identity through the attraction of Hellenistic philosophy and lifestyle. The tension between accommodation and resistance that characterized this period reveals the ongoing struggle between maintaining traditional values and adapting to changing circumstances. The Maccabean revolt that eventually resulted demonstrates how cultural pressure can trigger violent resistance when core identity is threatened. The Roman conquest that established the political context for the New Testament period represents the culmination of centuries of foreign domination and cultural struggle. The Jewish expectation of a political Messiah who would restore national independence reflects the natural human desire for liberation from oppression. The spiritual rather than political nature of Jesus' ministry challenged these expectations and required a fundamental reorientation of messianic hope. The birth of Jesus in Bethlehem during the Roman census reveals the convergence of political necessity and divine timing that characterizes pivotal moments in history. The humble circumstances of his birth, in a stable rather than palace, demonstrate how transformative leadership often emerges from unexpected sources. The angelic announcement to shepherds rather than political leaders shows how divine purposes often bypass established power structures. The visit of the Magi from the East demonstrates how spiritual truth can attract recognition across cultural boundaries. Their willingness to travel great distances based on astronomical observations shows sophisticated understanding of how natural signs can point to spiritual realities. Their worship of the infant Jesus and their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh reveal recognition of his royal, priestly, and sacrificial roles. Herod's massacre of the innocents in response to news of a rival king reveals the paranoid psychology that characterizes tyrannical leadership. His willingness to kill innocent children to protect his position demonstrates how fear can drive leaders to extreme measures that ultimately discredit their authority. The escape of Jesus to Egypt shows how divine protection can work through human wisdom and timely action. The 30 years of Jesus' preparation before beginning his public ministry demonstrate the importance of thorough development before assuming leadership responsibilities. His growth in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and man shows how authentic leadership requires development in multiple dimensions. The silence of the Gospels about this period suggests that preparation often occurs away from public attention. John the Baptist's ministry that preceded Jesus' public appearance demonstrates how revolutionary movements often require preparatory phases that create readiness for change. His call for repentance and his baptism of confession show understanding of how spiritual transformation requires acknowledgement of failure and commitment to new behavior. His recognition of Jesus as the greater one coming after him reveals the humility that characterizes authentic spiritual leadership. Jesus' baptism by John and the divine affirmation that followed demonstrate the importance of public identification with the movement one intends to lead. His willingness to submit to baptism, despite his sinless nature, shows understanding of how leaders must model the behavior they expect from followers. The Trinitarian manifestation at this moment reveals the divine authorization that authenticated his subsequent ministry. The temptation in the wilderness that immediately followed shows how spiritual authority is tested through direct challenge to its foundational principles. The three temptations, addressing physical needs, spectacular display, and political power, represent the primary areas where spiritual leadership can be corrupted. Jesus' responses, all drawn from Scripture, demonstrate how established principles can guide decision-making under pressure. The selection of the 12 apostles reveals sophisticated understanding of how to build effective teams for accomplishing complex missions. The diverse backgrounds and personalities of the men chosen show recognition that different skills and perspectives are needed for comprehensive ministry. Their gradual development from confused followers to effective leaders demonstrates how mentorship can transform ordinary individuals into extraordinary servants. The teaching methods Jesus employed, particularly his use of parables, reveal advanced understanding of how to communicate complex spiritual truths through accessible stories. The principle that spiritual understanding comes through engagement rather than mere explanation shows recognition of how learning occurs through active participation. His willingness to speak in parables, so that only those with genuine interest would understand, demonstrates how truth must be protected from those who would misuse it. The miracles Jesus performed weren't merely supernatural displays, but demonstrations of divine power working through natural principles to meet human needs. The healing of physical diseases, the multiplication of food, and the calming of storms all show how spiritual authority can override natural limitations when exercised for compassionate purposes. These demonstrations provided empirical evidence for his claims about divine authority and kingdom power. The opposition Jesus faced from religious leaders reveals how established institutions often resist innovations that challenge their authority. The progressive escalation of this conflict, from questioning to plotting to execution, demonstrates how threatened power structures will use any means necessary to eliminate perceived threats. This pattern shows how authentic spiritual leadership inevitably creates conflict with corrupted religious systems. The transfiguration experience that revealed Jesus' divine nature to his inner circle of disciples demonstrates how spiritual reality can occasionally break through physical limitations. The appearance of Moses and Elijah, representing law and prophets, shows how Jesus' ministry fulfilled rather than replaced previous revelation. Peter's desire to build permanent structures on the mountain reveals the human tendency to institutionalize transcendent experiences. The triumphal entry into Jerusalem that began the final week of Jesus' earthly ministry demonstrates how popular movements can create temporary political momentum. The crowd's enthusiasm and their messianic expectations show how spiritual leadership can generate hope for immediate change. The contrast between this celebration and the crucifixion that followed reveals how quickly public opinion can shift when expectations are disappointed. The cleansing of the temple that followed demonstrates how spiritual authority must sometimes use force to correct institutional corruption. Jesus' actions in overturning the money changers' tables and driving out the merchants show understanding of how commercial interests can corrupt religious institutions. This confrontation with established religious authority precipitated the final crisis that led to his death. The Last Supper that Jesus shared with his disciples provides profound insights into how leaders can prepare followers for their eventual absence. The institution of communion as a memorial practice shows understanding of how symbolic acts can maintain connection across time and space. His washing of the disciples' feet demonstrates how authentic leadership manifests through service rather than domination. The betrayal by Judas reveals the psychological factors that can corrupt even close associates of effective leaders. His motivation, whether financial gain or disappointment with Jesus' non-political approach, shows how unmet expectations can turn followers into enemies. The kiss used to identify Jesus demonstrates how intimate gestures can be perverted to serve destructive purposes. The trials before religious and civil authorities that followed reveal the legal and political complexities involved in executing someone without clear criminal charges. The coordination between Jewish religious leaders and Roman political authorities shows how different power structures can collaborate to eliminate common threats. Pilate's reluctance and his washing of hands demonstrate how political leaders often know what is right, but lack courage to act accordingly. The crucifixion itself represents the ultimate convergence of human injustice and divine purpose. The method of execution, designed for maximum humiliation and suffering, shows how political authority uses extreme measures to discourage resistance. The words Jesus spoke from the cross, including forgiveness for his executioners, demonstrate how spiritual authority can maintain love and purpose even under extreme suffering. The resurrection that followed 3 days later represents the most significant event in human history, demonstrating divine power over death itself. The initial disbelief of the disciples and their transformation into bold witnesses shows how empirical evidence can overcome even the strongest skepticism. The appearances to various groups over 40 days provided multiple confirmations that established the reality of this unprecedented event. The Great Commission that Jesus gave before his ascension demonstrates how transformative movements must expand beyond their original cultural boundaries to achieve their intended impact. The instruction to make disciples of all nations shows understanding of how spiritual principles can transcend ethnic and cultural limitations. The promise of divine presence until the end of the age provides assurance that this mission will ultimately succeed. The ascension itself represents the transition from visible to invisible spiritual authority, requiring followers to operate based on faith rather than sight. The promise of the Holy Spirit's coming shows understanding of how spiritual movements require internal empowerment rather than external compulsion. This transition from physical to spiritual leadership demonstrates how authentic authority can increase rather than decrease when it becomes less visible. These ancient accounts, when examined through modern understanding, reveal remarkable consistency between spiritual principles and psychological realities. The patterns they describe continue to influence human civilization, and their relevance to contemporary challenges suggests they contain enduring truths about leadership, social organization, and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. The convergence of ancient wisdom and modern insight points toward a unified understanding of reality that transcends the artificial divisions between spiritual and scientific knowledge. The arrival of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost wasn't just a religious experience, but a profound demonstration of how consciousness can transcend normal human limitations and create unprecedented unity across cultural barriers. When we examine this pivotal moment through the lens of modern neuroscience and communication theory, we discover remarkable insights about collective consciousness, linguistic processing, and the psychological mechanisms that enable rapid social transformation. The phenomenon of speaking in tongues that occurred when the Spirit descended reveals something extraordinary about the brain's capacity for linguistic adaptation. The disciples, most of whom were uneducated Galileans, suddenly possessed the ability to communicate complex spiritual concepts in languages they had never learned. Modern research in neuroplasticity shows that the brain can rapidly form new neural pathways under extreme circumstances. But the instantaneous acquisition of multiple foreign languages suggests something beyond normal cognitive adaptation. The crowd's reaction demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how authentic spiritual experiences can be distinguished from mere emotional enthusiasm. Their amazement centered not on the ecstatic behavior, but on the content and clarity of the communication. People from diverse ethnic backgrounds heard the gospel message in their native languages, complete with cultural nuances and emotional resonance that mere translation couldn't provide. This demonstrates how genuine spiritual transformation transcends cultural barriers through direct heart-to-heart communication. Peter's sermon that followed reveals advanced understanding of how to construct compelling arguments that connect historical precedent with present reality. His explanation of the Spirit's outpouring as fulfillment of ancient prophecy shows recognition of how people need continuity with their past to accept radical change. The integration of scripture quotations with contemporary observation demonstrates sophisticated rhetorical technique that modern communication specialists recognize as highly effective. The immediate response of 3,000 people accepting baptism shows how prepared hearts can recognize truth when presented with clarity and power. This mass conversion wasn't the result of emotional manipulation, but of rational conviction combined with spiritual illumination. The fact that these converts came from diverse cultural backgrounds, yet immediately formed a unified community, demonstrates how authentic spiritual experience creates bonds that transcend normal social divisions. The communal lifestyle that emerged among the early believers reveals profound insights about human social organization and the conditions that enable genuine cooperation. The sharing of possessions, the daily gathering for teaching and fellowship, and the priority given to caring for one another's needs created a social model that modern economists and sociologists recognize as remarkably sophisticated. This wasn't primitive communalism, but voluntary association based on shared values and mutual commitment. The miraculous healings that accompanied the apostles' ministry demonstrate how spiritual authority can manifest through restoration of physical and social wholeness. Peter's healing of the lame beggar at the temple gate wasn't just a supernatural display, but a demonstration of how divine power works to restore human dignity and social integration. The man's immediate ability to walk, leap, and praise God shows how genuine healing involves complete restoration rather than mere symptom relief. The opposition that quickly emerged from religious authorities reveals the psychological mechanisms that drive institutional resistance to transformative movements. The Sadducees' denial of resurrection doctrine made them particularly hostile to the apostles' message about Jesus' victory over death. Their arrest of Peter and John demonstrates how threatened authority structures will use legal mechanisms to suppress challenges to their power, even when those challenges are based on demonstrable truth. The believer's response to persecution shows remarkable understanding of how spiritual movements can maintain momentum despite external pressure. Their prayer for boldness, rather than protection, demonstrates recognition that authentic spiritual authority grows stronger under opposition. The physical shaking of the building where they prayed suggests that intense collective faith can create measurable effects in the physical environment. The case of Ananias and Sapphira provides crucial insights into how deception can corrupt spiritual communities, and why absolute honesty is essential for maintaining group integrity. Their attempt to appear generous while secretly withholding part of their gift demonstrates how the desire for reputation can motivate dishonest behavior. The immediate divine judgment that followed shows how spiritual communities must maintain clear boundaries to prevent corruption from spreading. The appointment of deacons to handle practical matters reveals sophisticated understanding of how to structure organizations for maximum effectiveness. The recognition that apostolic leaders should focus on prayer and teaching while others handle administrative responsibilities demonstrates early understanding of role specialization and delegation. The selection criteria emphasizing character and spiritual maturity shows recognition that even practical leadership requires moral authority. Stephen's ministry and martyrdom demonstrate how intellectual brilliance combined with spiritual power can create compelling witness that threatens established systems. His detailed knowledge of Jewish history and his ability to construct systematic theological arguments show how scholarship can serve spiritual purposes. The supernatural appearance of his face during his trial reveals how divine authority can manifest through human vessels in ways that transcend normal charismatic appeal. The persecution that followed Stephen's death served to spread the gospel beyond Jerusalem as believers were scattered throughout the region. Philip's ministry in Samaria demonstrates how cultural barriers can be overcome when spiritual power is combined with genuine love and respect for different peoples. The Ethiopian eunuch's conversion shows how prepared hearts can recognize truth even when encountered in unexpected contexts. Saul's dramatic conversion on the Damascus Road represents one of history's most significant examples of how radical worldview changes can occur through direct spiritual encounter. His transformation from persecutor to apostle demonstrates how even the most hardened opponents can become powerful advocates when confronted with undeniable truth. The physical blindness that accompanied his conversion symbolizes how spiritual sight often requires the temporary loss of natural vision. Paul's missionary journeys that followed reveal sophisticated understanding of how to establish sustainable spiritual communities across diverse cultural contexts. His strategy of beginning in synagogues before moving to Gentile audiences shows recognition of how to build bridges between established and emerging belief systems. The persecution he faced in each city demonstrates how authentic spiritual authority inevitably creates conflict with existing power structures. The Jerusalem Council's decision to welcome Gentiles without requiring circumcision represents one of history's most significant examples of how spiritual movements can transcend ethnic boundaries. The debate between Jewish and Gentile perspectives shows how divine guidance can work through human discussion and reasoning. The compromise solution that emerged demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to maintain unity while respecting diversity. Paul's letters to the churches reveal profound insights into human psychology, social organization, and the practical challenges of building communities based on spiritual principles. His analysis of human nature, his instructions for resolving conflicts, and his vision of unified diversity demonstrate remarkable understanding of how to create stable societies that can function across cultural boundaries. The theological depth of his writings shows how spiritual truth can be expressed through systematic rational argument. The persecution under Nero that began in 64 AD demonstrates how political authority will use extreme measures to suppress movements that challenge the foundations of social order. The mass execution of Christians, including their use as human torches to light the emperor's gardens, shows how threatened power structures will resort to spectacular violence to intimidate potential converts. The fact that these persecutions actually strengthened rather than weakened the Christian movement reveals the counterproductive nature of attempting to destroy spiritual truth through physical force. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD represents the end of the Old Covenant system and the validation of Jesus' prophecies about the temple's destruction. The Christians' escape to Pella before the siege demonstrates how spiritual insight can provide practical guidance for avoiding disaster. The complete destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jewish people shows how divine judgment can work through natural historical processes. The completion of the New Testament canon during this period represents one of history's most significant literary achievements, creating a collection of writings that would influence human civilization for millennia. The careful selection of texts that demonstrated apostolic authority and theological consistency shows sophisticated understanding of how to preserve authentic spiritual teaching across generations. The rejection of numerous alternative writings demonstrates recognition that not all religious literature contains genuine divine revelation. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire during the 1st century reveals how spiritual truth can transcend political, ethnic, and social boundaries when presented with clarity and demonstrated through transformed lives. The establishment of churches in major cities from Jerusalem to Rome created a network of communities that could maintain connection and mutual support despite geographical separation. This expansion shows how authentic spiritual movements naturally grow when they meet genuine human needs. The Book of Revelation, written during the persecution under Domitian, provides a prophetic vision of how spiritual truth will ultimately triumph over all opposition. The symbolic language and apocalyptic imagery demonstrate how spiritual insight can perceive divine purposes operating through historical events. The promise of final victory and the establishment of divine kingdom provides hope that transcends immediate circumstances and gives meaning to present suffering. The early church's survival and growth, despite intense persecution, demonstrates how spiritual movements that address fundamental human needs can overcome any external opposition. The transformation of the Roman Empire from Christianity's greatest enemy to its official patron within 3 centuries shows how authentic spiritual truth can eventually reshape entire civilizations. This historical pattern suggests that movements based on genuine spiritual principles possess inherent advantages over those based merely on political or economic power. The principles established during this foundational period continue to influence human civilization today, demonstrating their enduring relevance to fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and ultimate purpose. The convergence of ancient spiritual wisdom with modern scientific understanding suggests that these early insights contain genuine truth about the nature of reality itself. The ongoing impact of these first-century events on contemporary global culture shows how pivotal moments in history can create effects that extend far beyond their immediate context. The story that began with creation's first light continues to unfold through human history, revealing consistent patterns of divine purpose, working through natural processes and human choices. The ancient truths hidden in biblical accounts aren't just historical curiosities, but living principles that continue to shape reality at the deepest levels. Understanding these connections between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge provides a framework for comprehending both our origins and our destiny. As we conclude this journey through history's hidden truths, we discover that the questions that drove ancient seekers are the same ones that drive modern scientists, philosophers, and spiritual searchers. The convergence of biblical revelation with scientific discovery suggests that truth is unified, that spiritual and natural reality are complementary rather than contradictory. The ancient accounts we've explored provide a roadmap for understanding not just where we came from, but where we're heading and why our existence matters in the grand scope of cosmic history. The ultimate revelation hidden in these ancient texts is that human consciousness, moral awareness, and spiritual capacity aren't accidents of evolution, but fundamental features of a universe designed for relationship, meaning, and transcendent purpose. The story that began before time itself continues to unfold through each generation, inviting us to participate in purposes that extend far beyond our individual existence into the very heart of cosmic reality.